Hello, I'm Sarah Watson, Director of the Murphy Institute at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, and I'm thrilled to welcome you today for a live poetry reading and conversation with the renowned poet Martina Espada. This event is the outgrowth of a brand new course on contemporary working class poetry offered at the School of Labor and Urban Studies. This course discusses the growing body of award-winning poetry written by U.S. poets about work and working class lives and all their diversity. The course is taught by Paula Finn, who is the longtime editor of SLU's journal, New Labor Forum, which regularly publishes poetry, including on occasion the poetry of Martina Espada. Before turning the program over to Paula, I want to thank Michael Lalonde and Nadia Rahman from the public programming team for running all of the logistics for today's program. Martine, thank you so much for being here with us today, and I'll turn the program over to Paula. Thank you.
All right. Thanks to you, Sarah. And thanks to SLU's public programming team for making this reading possible. As someone who's followed the work of Martin Espada, not for years, but for decades, I'm elated to have him read his work to students and to the broader audience of labor and social justice activists who joined us this evening. The past quarter century has seen an upsurge in the number, the diversity, and the prominence of working class poets publishing and performing their work in the United States. Politically and socially engaged poets of the working class, poets of color, and LGBTQ plus poets are increasingly winning major awards like the Pulitzer National Book Award, being named Poet Laureate. Martin Espada has played a monumental role in blazing the trail that has made this possible. In his essay collection, Zapata's Disciple, he writes, quote, "For some poets, social class is just a triangle in the orchestra, a distant tinkling. For me, the matter of social class is the beat itself, an insistent percussion." Espada's work celebrates the heroism and laments the deep injustices of working class life. And in doing so, it speaks to and about those who rarely encounter themselves, their jobs, their neighborhoods in literature. Espada has published more than 20 books as a poet, editor, essayist, and translator. His recent book called Floaters won the prestigious National Book Award. Other books of poetry include Vivas to Those Who Have Failed, The Trouble Ball, The Republic of Poetry, and Alabanza. He is the editor of What Saves Us, Poems of Empathy and Outrage in the Age of Trump. He's received many awards, including the Shelley Memorial Award and a Guggenheim Fellowship. The Republic of Poetry was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His book of essays and poems, Zapata's Disciple, won the distinction of being banned in Tucson as part of the Mexican American Studies program outlawed by the state of Arizona. A former tenant lawyer and in Greater Boston, Espada is a professor of English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Thanks so much, Martine, for reading your work today and for agreeing to answer questions from the audience.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Paula Finn and her students in the Contemporary Working Class Poetry course. And thanks to everyone who's here this evening. The format tonight will be very simple. I'm going to read 5 poems and follow that up with a Q&A. I'm going to begin with a poem called Alabanza. Now, this is a 9/11 poem, but it's a 9/11 poem with a twist. The focus is on the food service workers who were killed that day. Most of them immigrant, and many of them undocumented, invisible in life, and even more invisible in death. So it's a poem about immigrant labor too. And I can't help but think now of the 6 construction workers who were killed in the collapse of the Key Bridge in Baltimore. As it turns out, all migrants from Mexico and Central America. The word alabanza means praise in Spanish. Alabanza, in praise of Local 100. With the 43 members of hotel employees and restaurant employees, Local 100, working at the Windows on the World restaurant, who lost their lives in the attack on the World Trade Center. Alabanza. Praise the cook with a shaven head and a tattoo on his shoulder that said, Oye. A blue-eyed Puerto Rican with people from Fajardo, the harbor of pirates centuries ago. Praise the lighthouse in Fajardo, candle glimmering white to worship the dark sing to the sea. Alabanza. Praise the cook's yellow pirate's cap worn in the name of Roberto Clemente, his plane that flamed into the ocean loaded with cans for Nicaragua, for all the mouths chewing the ash of earthquakes. Alabanza. Praise the kitchen radio dial clicked even before the dial on the oven, so that music and Spanish rose before bread. Praise the bread. Alabanza. Praise Manhattan from 107 flights up, like Atlantis glimpsed through the windows of an ancient aquarium. Praise the great windows where immigrants from the kitchen could squint and almost see their world. Hear the chant of nations. Ecuador, Mexico, República Dominicana, Haiti, Yemen, Ghana, Bangladesh, Alabanza. Praise the kitchen in the morning, where the gas burned blue on every stove and exhaust fans fired their diminutive propellers. Hands cracked eggs with quick thumbs or sliced open cartons to build an altar of cans. Alabanza. Praise the busboys' music, the chime of his dishes and silverware in the tub. Alabanza. Praise the dish dog, the dishwasher who worked that morning because another dishwasher could not stop coughing, or because he needed overtime to pile the sacks of rice and beans for a family floating away on some Caribbean island plagued by frogs. Alabanza. Praise the waitress who heard the radio in the kitchen and sang to herself about a man gone. Alabanza. After the thunder, wilder than thunder. After the shudder deep in the glass of the great windows. After the radio stopped singing like a tree full of terrified frogs. After night burst the dam of day and flooded the kitchen. For a time, the stoves glowed in darkness like the lighthouse in Fajardo, like a cook's soul. Soul, I say, even if the dead cannot tell us about the bristles of God's beard, because God has no face. Soul, I say, to name the smoke beings flung in constellations across the night sky of this city and cities to come. Alabanza, I say, even if God has no face. Alabanza. When the war began, from Manhattan and Kabul, too, constellations of smoke rose and drifted to each other, mingling in icy air, and one said with an Afghan tongue, "Teach me to dance. We have no music here." And the other said with a Spanish tongue, "I will teach you. Music is all we have." We flash forward to June of 2019. Two Salvadoran migrants, father and daughter, came to be known simply as Oscar and Valeria, drowned crossing the Rio Grande. A photograph of their bodies went viral. You might remember it, sparking outrage, sparking grief, and also sparking skepticism. There was a post in the I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group charging that this photograph was a fake. Floaters, the poem speaks to this photograph and to these charges. Floaters, the word, is a term used by many members of the Border Patrol to describe those who drown crossing over. And so this poem also has an epigraph. Floaters. Epigraph. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask, have you all ever seen floaters this clean? I'm not trying to be an ass, but I have never seen floaters like this. Could this be another edited photo? We've all seen the Dems and liberal parties do some pretty sick things. Anonymous post. I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group. Like a beer bottle thrown into the river by a boy too drunk to cry. Like the shard of a styrofoam cup drained of coffee, brown as the river. Like the plank of a fishing boat broken in half by the river. The dead float, and the dead have a name. Floaters, say the men of the Border Patrol, keeping watch all night by the river. Hearts pumping coffee as they say the word floaters, soft as a bubble, hard as a shoe as it nudges the body to see if it breathes, to see if it moans, to see if it sits up and speaks. And the dead have names. A feast day parade of names, names that dress all in red, names that twirl skirts, names that blow whistles, names that shake rattles, names that sing in praise of the saints. Say, Oscar, Alberto, Martinez, Ramirez. Say, Angie, Valeria, Martinez, Avalos. See how they rise off the tongue, the calling of bird to bird somewhere in the trees above our heads, trilling in the dark heart of the leaves. Say what we know of them now they are dead. Oscar slapped dough for pizza with oven blistered fingers. Daughter Valeria sang, banging a toy guitar. He slipped free of the apron he wore in the blast of the oven, sold the motorcycle he would kick till it sputtered to life, counted off pesos for the journey across the river, and the last of his 25 years, and the last of her 23 months. There is another name that beats its wings in the heart of the trees. Say, Tanya, Vanessa, Avalos, Oscar's wife, and Valeria's mother, the witness stumbling along the river. Now their names rise off her tongue. Say, Oscar y Valeria. He swam from Matamoros across to Bronzeville. The girl slung around his neck, stood her in the weeds on the Texas side of the river, swore to return with her mother at hand, turning his back as fathers do, who later say, I turned around and she was gone. In the time it takes for a bird to hop from branch to branch, Valeria jumped in the river after her father. Maybe he called out her name as he swept her up from the river. Maybe the river drowned out his voice as the water swept them away. Tanya called out the names of the saints, but the saints drowse in the stupor of birds in the dark, the cages covered with blankets. The men on patrol would never hear their pleas for asylum, watching for floaters, hearts pumping coffee all night on the Texas side of the river. No one, they say, had ever seen floaters this clean. Oscar's black shirt yanked up to the armpits. Valeria's arms slung around her father's neck, even after the light left her eyes, both face down in the weeds back on the Mexican side of the river. Another edited photo. See how her head disappears in his shirt, the waterlogged diaper bunched in her pants, the blue of the blue cans. The radio warned us about the crisis actors we see at one school shooting after another. The man called. Oscar will breathe, sit up, speak, tug the black shirt over his head, shower off the mud, and shake hands with the photographer. Yet, The floaters did not float down the Rio Grande like Olympians showing off the backstroke, nor did their souls float up to Dallas, land of rumored jobs and a president shot in the head as he waved from his motorcade. No bubbles rose from their breath in the mud, light as the iridescent circles of soap that would fascinate a 2-year-old. And the dead still have names. Names that sing in praise of the saints, names of flower and blossoms of white, a cortege of names dressed all in black, trailing the coffins to the cemetery. Carve their names in headlines and gravestones they would never know in the kitchens of this cacophonous world. Enter their names in the book of names. Say, Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez. Say, Angie Valeria Martinez Avalos. Bury them in a corner of the cemetery named for the sainted Archbishop of the Poor, shot in the heart saying Mass, bullets bought by the taxes I paid when I worked as a bouncer and fractured my hand 40 years ago, and bumper stickers read, El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. When the last bubble of breath escapes the body, may the men who speak of floaters, who have never seen floaters this clean, float through the clouds to the heavens, where they paddle the air as they wait for the saint who flips through the keys on his ring like a drowsy janitor, till he fingers the key that turns the lock and shuts the gate on their babble-tongued faces, and they plunge back to earth, a shower of hailstones pelting the river, the Mexican side of the river. Of course, this migration is nothing new. I saw it 30 years ago. I was a tenant lawyer with a program called Su Clínica Legal, a legal services program for low-income Spanish-speaking tenants in Chelsea, Massachusetts, right across the Tobin Bridge from Boston. I witnessed an urban climate crisis, that is to say, people without heat in the winter. And here's a poem based on that experience. The city wears a coat to bed. The white army of winter spreads across the city. Boilers and radiators die in their sleep, their skin cold to the touch in the morning. The city wears a coat to bed. The city watches the wraith of breath rise in the kitchen. On Friday afternoons, the judges slip off their black robes and drive home. There is no light in the windows of the courthouse. There is no one to read the affidavit or sign the injunction to shove into the landlord's hand, so that heat courses through the heart of the boiler and the looping hard veins of the radiator again. No one to hear the tenant's story translated, her sons and daughters shivering in their coats on the mattress, snot on their sleeves. The judges on the landlord home are stopping in a bar on the way home. She tells me instead, the lawyer who speaks Spanish, and explains in Spanish why there will be no heat this weekend, why there is no one at the courthouse to listen, and still she pours her story into my ears till they swell to bursting. I walk her to the doorway of the office. The secretary is in the bathroom, the office space heater in the corner. Suddenly, I am steering the tenant out the door with the space heater in her arms as she says gracias over and over, and I say okay, knowing the secretary would yell my name louder than the time a drunk with a lightning scar on his belly charged through the door naked, but for his socks and a Salvation Army blanket. The secretary would not miss the office space heater till Monday. I am the hero of this story, riding the bus home across the bridge, till I remember the words I should have said about the glowing coils too close to the mattress, How every week another fire rolls the smoldering wraith of winter through the bedroom as sons and daughters sleep. How every week EMTs tuck white sheets over bodies dead as a landlord's boiler. I will dream with eyes open of windows, the coils of space heaters and the coils of mattresses glowing in every window. This next poem is also about labor, the labor of teaching and the labor of learning to read. My wife, Lauren, is a poet and a teacher. She taught in urban ed for many years. She also served as a volunteer teacher at a drug and alcohol rehab center in Paterson, New Jersey. She is the tutor in this next poem. Gonzo. Everybody knew Gonzo, his cigarettes and cologne, his gold crucifix, the white t-shirt he wore to every meeting. They leaned closer to listen whenever he spoke in the circle at the rehab center, some with eyes shut, seeing his confessions of addiction's demons and sobriety's angels at war. No one knew Gonzo signed his name with an X. The tutor at the rehab center held up flashcards and sounded out the letters A, B, C. There was no alphabet song in Gonzo's head, no teacher at the blackboard. He said the letters one by one. At the letter S, he stopped. The tutor studied Gonzo's nose, long but not as long as the nose of the Muppet with the same name. S, she said again. Gonzo had no front teeth, no place for his tongue to go. He puffed and sprayed, a man unable to navigate the river of his own name, Gonzales. He hid his face in his hands, unlettered cards in his head, as if the tutor could not see him now. A sob surged through him, a beast chained to the rock of his ribs for 50 years, since the days the roosters woke him up for school in Puerto Rico. He wiped his face clean. Gonzo was clean, clean fingernails, clean shaven, clean white shirt. The tutor waited, thinking, he doesn't know his letters, but he knows every street in Paterson by name. She squeezed Gonzo's wrist once, then again, till his eyes met hers. She held up the next flashcard. She said, say T. And this will be the last poem I read, and then there'll be time for questions. My father, Francisco Luis Espada, Frank Espada, was born in the mountain town of Utuado, Puerto Rico in the year 1930 and died at Pacifica, California in the year 2014. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in the year 2017, I saw his hometown of Utuado everywhere, over and over on TV and the internet, headlines. As John Lee Anderson put it in the pages of the New Yorker, Utuado had become, quote, a byword for the island's devastation. And let's keep in mind that 4,000 people died in Puerto Rico. And so I started talking to my father, who had died 3 years before that. Actually, I started talking to his ashes in a box. And that was the genesis of this last poem. And it's called Letter to My Father, October 2017. You once said My reward for this life will be 1,000 pounds of dirt shoveled in my face. You were wrong. You are 7 pounds of ashes in a box, a Puerto Rican flag wrapped around you next to a red brick from the house in Utuado where you were born, all crammed together on my bookshelf. You taught me there is no God, no life after this life, so I know you're not watching me type this letter over my shoulder. When I was a boy, you were God. I watched from the 7th floor of the projects as you walked down into the street to stop a public execution. A big man caught a small man stealing his car, and everyone in Brooklyn heard the car alarm wail of the condemned. He's killing me. At a word from you, the executioner's hand slipped from the hair of the thief. The kid was high, was all you said when you came back to us. When I was a boy and you were God, we flew to Puerto Rico. You said, my grandfather was the mayor of Utuado. His name was Buenaventura. That means good fortune. I believed in your grandfather's name. I heard the tree frogs chanting to each other all night. I saw a banana leaf and elephant palm sprouting from the mountain's belly. I gnawed the mango's pit, and the sweet yellow hair stuck between my teeth. I said to you, you came from another planet. How'd you do it? You said, every morning, just before I woke up, I saw the mountains. Every morning, I see the mountains. In Utuado, 3 sisters, all in their 70s, all bedridden, all Pentecostales who only left the house with church, lay sleeping on mattresses spread across the floor when the hurricane gutted the mountain the way a butcher slices open a dangled pig, and a rolling wall of mud buried them, leaving the 4 sisters to stagger into the street, screaming like an unheeded prophet about the end of the world. And Utuado, a man who cultivated a garden of aguacate and carambola, feeding the avocado and star fruit to his nieces from New York, so the trees in his garden beheaded all at once like the soldiers of a beaten army, and so hanged himself. And Utuado, a welder and a handyman, rigged a pulley with a shopping cart to ferry rice and beans across the river where the bridge collapsed, witnessed the cart swaying above so many hands that raised a sign that told the helicopters, Campamento Los Olvidados, Camp of the Forgotten. Los Olvidados wait 7 hours in line for a government meal of Skittles and Vienna sausage, or a tart to cover the bones of a house with no roof as the fungus grows on their skin from sleeping on mattresses drenched with the spit of the hurricane. They drink the brown water, waiting for microscopic monsters in their bellies to visit plagues upon them. A nurse says, these people are going to have an epidemic. These people are going to die. The president flips rolls of paper towels to a crowd at a church in Guaynabo, Zeus lobbing thunderbolts on the locked ward of his delusions. Down the block, cousin Ricardo, Bernice's boy, says that somebody stole his can of diesel. I heard somebody ask you once if Puerto Rico needed to be free, and you said, 3 pulgadas de sangre en la calle. 3 inches of blood in the street. Now, 3 inches of mud flow through the streets of Utuado, and troops patrol the town as if guarding the vein of copper in the ground, as if a shovel digging graves in the backyard might strike the ore below, as if La Brigada, swinging machetes to clear the road, might remember the last uprising. I know you are not God. I have the proof. 7 pounds of ashes in a box on my bookshelf. Gods do not die. And yet, I want you to be God again. Stride from the crowd to seize the president's arm before another roll of paper towels sails away. thunder Spanish obscenities in his face, banish him to a ruthless rainstorm in Utuado, so he unravels one soaked sheet after another till there is nothing left but his cardboard heart. I promised myself I would stop talking to you, white box of gray grit. You were deaf even before you died. Hear my promise now. I will take you to the mountains where houses lost like ships at sea rise, blue and yellow from the mud. I will open my hands. I will scatter your ashes. En Utuado. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. It was great to hear you read a number of the poems that we've read in class. We have some students who'd like to ask you questions. There was a lot of admiration for your work, particularly your ability to write political poems that never veer towards sloganeering, which is sometimes an issue with political poetry. And there are a number of questions that people wanted to ask you that had to do with political poetry. Let's start with Martin. We have a Martin, not Martin, but Martin. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Yeah, my question was about that, like the blending of the personal with the political. Like your poems seem to tell these intimate stories that point to larger structural and societal issues. So I was wondering where inspiration most often comes from, like the root of a poem. Does it start at the personal level, or do you see, a structural or something bigger, broader, more political, and then find the personal narrative within it?
Well, for me, it starts with story. I am a narrative poet, and
Right.
these are storytelling poems. The stories in turn come from those all around me. Family, friends, community, and of course, self, the experience I have personally. It's rare, but it does happen that I will reach outside of those concentric circles to find a story to tell, a poem to write. Floaters is a good example of that. And for that matter, so too was Alabanza. And the fact that I began with those two is unusual. They're atypical in that way. More typical of the poems you heard after that. The model for this way of looking at the world, and the model for this way of gleaning the subject matter comes from my father. My father, I mentioned, Frank Espada, was a documentary photographer. He was the creator of something called the Puerto Rican Diaspora Documentary Project, the photo documentary of the Puerto Rican migration. He ended up doing a number of one-person shows throughout the United States. He put out a book also called the Puerto Rican Diaspora. And now you can actually find his photographs in the collections of the Smithsonian Museum of American History, Smithsonian Museum of American Art, National Portrait Gallery, Library of Congress, so on and so forth. But he was also a storyteller. It so happened that his medium was the camera. I grew up with that, and I thought that's what everybody did.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Also related, Annie, you had a question that you wanted to ask. Yep.
Yes, thank you so much for your time and for your beautiful reading. So my question is kind of about your experience with your intergenerational perspective of the Puerto Rican political movement and how you've seen art and language culture evolve in its role of affecting change and influencing public perception of island politics.
So you're interested in island politics in particular, as opposed to, say, the Puerto Rican community in the United States.
Yes, and maybe how those two might be linked as well, but specifically in relation to anti-imperialism efforts.
Well, I am, let me be clear, and if you read my work, it is quite clear. I am an independentista. That is to say, I'm a believer in the independence of Puerto Rico. And in turn, I was influenced by independentista artists and writers going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. One of my mentors, Clemente Soto Vélez, was born in the year 1905 and ultimately would become a political prisoner because he advocated the independence of Puerto Rico from the United States. So when you have those kinds of mentors, it's very easy to be what you're referring to as an anti-imperialist. That runs in your veins. And again, I said this in response to the first question. I thought this is the way everybody saw the world. I was in for quite a rude awakening. Now, of course, colonialism is insidious. It's internalized. It's also often invisible to the colonizer. So good luck trying to call the attention of the larger public to this issue. One of the great foundational myths of the United States is that the United States is not an empire, overlooking, about 100 different historical examples we could point to. Most people in this country do not see the United States as an empire. And therefore, if it's not an empire, it cannot possibly have colonies. And so there's that little leap of logic that enables people to then ignore the Puerto Rican case, or to say, let's have another referendum, which of course is itself a political sleight of hand, because if you spend the better part of the 20th century repressing the independence movement, then naturally the referendum is going to turn out the way you, the colonizer, wants it to turn out. What is the purpose of the poet in pointing this out? Well, it's just the way I see it is the poet's job to be a pain in the ass. And whether, and, it depends on, your experience and your context, your history. But, one way or another, yes, pain in the ass. And I am just going to keep bringing it up and hope that, in some small way, what I do will make some difference at some point. People often look at political poetry and not just say anti-imperialist poetry or poetry having to do with the independence of the island and say, well, what do you have to show for it? What difference could it possibly make? And my usual response to that objection is that poetry, political poetry, social change in general are not linear phenomena. It's not linear, right? It zigs and it zags and it moves in figures of 8 and up and down. And we have no way of knowing when we put a poem or any sort of idea into the atmosphere what's going to happen to it, where it's going to land, and when, who it's going to affect when that happens. And so paradoxically, political poetry becomes an act of faith. And I say that as one who has very little of the traditional sort of faith that you used to see.
Thank you.
Trevor's actually writing his whole midterm on your work. So let's get Trevor's question.
Okay, Trevor's going to get an A.
Thank you so much for being with us. So my question does overlap a little bit with something that my classmates were saying. But if there is something inherently political about your approach to poetry, is there also something poetic about a certain kind of politics that may or may not emerge from your poetry?
Well, I believe that's an excellent question. I believe that there is. I believe that there's a certain kind of political practice which has within it the element of poetry. And that's the political practice that sees the humanity all around. It's the kind of political practice where you as an organizer, or you as a writer, or you as a teacher can see the eyes, the nose, the face of the people you with whom you are concerned. Too often, and let me sort of climb down off my soapbox for a minute. Too often, we as political people, whether we're organizers or whether what we do takes some other form, deal only in abstractions. Think about all the times you've heard people on the left talk in great big abstractions, in generalities, in large numbers. We need, as political people, as organizers, as teachers, as writers, etc., to give it a human face, to individualize it. Find the face that has many faces. Find the moment that stands for a century, and talk that way and think that way. Remember that the people that you are for whom you advocate could very easily advocate for themselves, given the chance. They just don't get the chance. And so, we must never sort of condescend or look down on the people for whom we speak. We speak for them because they don't have the opportunity to speak for themselves. So I guess that to me is a kind of poetic political practice.
Trevor, you have a related follow-up question that I think is worth posing too.
Okay, yeah, sure. So thinking about kind of this democratic spirit that you were speaking to, do you think that movement politics in particular could benefit from opening up more space for poetry? Or do you think that poetry should or must flourish independently from political movements or political thought, political action?
Well, I don't believe poetry should be independent of anything. Poetry should live in the world. Poetry should be part of the air that we breathe. I've never believed in art for art's sake, which means I don't believe in poetry for poetry's sake. I believe that we should be communicating. You can't communicate unless you have some kind of dialogue going on. We have to be grounded in that. So, I think that, but that certain kinds of poetry, a certain kind of poetics, will be involved and engaged with the world, right? If your poetry is incomprehensible, then it is essentially irrelevant. If your poetry is a series of consonants, one right after the other, and you think of it and yourself as experimental, well, good for you, but you're not going to communicate with other people. Is that responsive to your question? Is that where you're going with this? Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, one of the other poets whose work we read in class was Etheridge Knight. And I understand when he was a teacher, he used to actually take his students out to the curb and have them read to common folks and get a sense of How important is or isn't the poem, and how accessible is it or isn't it? Interesting.
Well, I knew Etheridge Knight,
Mm,
and he was a great poet of the prison experience.
mhm,
And I have done a number of readings over the years, and in jails and prisons, and I've discovered that there's a great deal of poetry going on behind those walls. In fact, I've concluded that prison is the greatest repository of wasted talent in our culture.
yeah.
And of course, I'm not the only one who feels that way. There's a poet by the name of Reginald Dwayne Betts, who himself came from the prison experience,
Mhm,
and now has created a program called Freedom Reads,
mhm.
where he has established a network of libraries in prisons across the country and sent poets to visit these prisons, myself included.
Yeah, we've been reading his work as well. So thanks for mentioning. Next person, Danielle, you have do you want to choose one of your questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, how are you? Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. My question is, while growing up, your father, Frank, was a leader in the Puerto Rican community and civil rights movement. In class, we read your moving poem, Letter to My Father. Please talk about a discouraging and or frightening experience you experienced at a young age. Also, how did it influence your artistic and personal development?
Well, I am from the East New York section, Brooklyn. I was born there, raised in the Linden Projects.
Mm,
If you're familiar with that part of Brooklyn, you know the projects right across the street from Gershwin Junior High School. That's where I grew up. So frightening experiences were a fairly regular occurrence for me. I was a little fat kid. I couldn't run away from fights, couldn't run away from anything. And I, I can remember once being hit in the head with a can and it split my scalpel. Um, head wounds really bleed a lot. And I reminisced with this. I reminisced with my mother many years later. I remember that time I got hit in the head with a can in the street. And she said, "Yeah." She says, "Was that a full can or an empty can?" That's my mother. Many years later, I wrote a poem about it. So one of the ways, I mean, today we would use the word trauma. That word was not part of our vocabulary. I was born in 1957, so you can imagine we didn't acknowledge trauma, much less have a vocabulary of trauma. We didn't talk about certain things. But one way for me to wrestle with a frightening experience like that one, where I was like covered in blood, and I mean covered, was ultimately to write about it. And of course the memory was very, very vivid. And what I remembered was that I was knocking on doors in the hallway because I knew my father wasn't home. My mother did not have a car; she didn't drive, and I knew we had to get to the hospital. I didn't know how we were going to do it. And of course, if you're living in a place like that, and you have you can look through the peephole, the door, right? Like in the projects, there, that project peephole. And you see this kid standing in the hallway and he's all red. The last thing you want to do is open the door. So that stood out to me when I sat down to write the poem. That's what I remembered. All that knocking.
mhm,
So that's what I did with it.
mhm. We have a poem, we have a question that has to do more with form, and that's from Danny. Where are you, Danny?
Hi, yeah. Thanks so much for this amazing event. I'm really appreciative of you taking the time. I noticed that a lot of your poems, including I think all the poems you read tonight, have like a pretty distinctive visual form when they're written out, like with long lines and stanzas that kind of look like paragraphs. And we also read at least one of your poems that has like a really different form with like much shorter lines. And I'm curious like what you think about in terms of how you want to make a poem look on the page in order to convey something.
Yeah.
And I think the poem you're talking about is Jorge the Janitor, right? What's his, yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that your class read that poem. That's a very early poem. So the lines are very short. I think I published that poem in 1990 in a collection called Rebellions, a Circle of a Lover's Hands. So it's like looking at a star or that light has moved on. And now, in fact, the last 3 books, including the one that will be coming out next, you see the lines getting longer and longer and longer. The lineation is really the influence of Walt Whitman. You know, you look at Whitman's lines in Leaves of Grass, but especially in Song of Myself, long, long lines, these loping lines into which he put all this momentum and rhythm and power. And I think that just stuck with me as a fairly relatively recent influence in my poetic life. But something else you mentioned, you use the word visual. I don't want to point to something else that's visual, the language. In fact, the poems, all of them, are grounded in the image, not just the visual sense, but all 5 senses on paper. That is, we use the word image to describe not just the visual sense, but all 5. And it's grounding those poems in the senses that keep them from flying away into the clouds of rhetoric, right? And that was an observation that some of the students made, that this is not the rhetorical or didactic political poem that we're used to seeing. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because I'm grounding this work, these narratives, these political poems in the senses, in the image, and that makes them different.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Miss Harris has a question actually about how we could have lived and died this way, which we read in class. Good. You need to unmute yourself.
You're muted.
Okay. Oh, muted again.
Still muted.
Okay, there we go. Hi, good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for being with us this evening. This has been a wonderful, wonderful experience. My question is, I wanted to know what was your main inspiration for the poem? How could we have lived or died this way?
Well, that's a poem that was in previous collection. It wasn't in Floaters. It must have been in the last one, Vivas for Those Who Have Failed. And, you know, I mean, the historical memory is 15 minutes long, somebody once said. In recent history, we can all refer to George Floyd in 2020, you know, and the outrage that accompanied that police murder of George Floyd. And then, of course, between the movement that rose around his murder and subsequent media coverage, we saw more and more of these cases come to the public eye. But of course, this has been going on forever. And we tend to forget that, you know, about a decade ago, the decade before George Floyd, there was a wave of police killings people of color, particularly African Americans. And that poem you're referring to was about that wave, how we could have lived or died this way. And the thesis of the poem is, what will history make of us?
Mhm.
You know, how will future generations look back on us, and will they wonder how we could have lived or died this way? You know, will we finally evolve as a society to the point where this is unthinkable? Because you know what? We haven't done it yet.
Indeed.
Yeah. Yeah, and the extent to which we haven't done it yet, we had a kind of a whole unit on policing and prisons, such is the volume of poetry written on those topics. I want to turn now to Sebastian.
Hi, thank you again for speaking with our class. It's lovely to hear you read. And my question is about, well, you mentioned the influence of Walt Whitman, and it's about that and really about the wide range of voices you encompass in your work. We talked about Walt Whitman in this class as being this kind of one of the foundational figures in American poetry, writing with this very democratic and expansive voice. He doesn't just try to encompass his own perspective. There's this broad we, and I really see that in your work. I mean, just the poems you've read or talked about tonight span people from so many different countries, all kinds of backgrounds that are very different from your own. Even Letter to My Father, like a very personal poem, there's this very capacious sense of the community in Utuado and throughout Puerto Rico. So yeah, I'm interested in that wide range of perspectives that you're writing from and that you're writing to. And I wonder, what are the challenges and what are the opportunities you find in writing from such a broad perspective? And do you think it's important that more artists take that up?
Well, I'm interested in a great many things. And so while many of my poems are autobiographical, I'm constantly reading. When I am awake, I'm reading. It's compulsive. I can't help myself. And the books come from every conceivable direction. You'd think that mostly what I'm reading is poetry, but in fact, that wouldn't be the case. Mostly I read nonfiction. Whether it's journalism or history, for the hell of it, I read about film. I have a student. I'm very proud of him. His name is Mike Zendejas. And what I like best about Mike is that Mike, quite aside from all his other attributes, decided he wanted to be a film critic. So I got to read his blog every week, and I learned a lot about film from him. You know, so I'm voracious in that way. I'm constantly devouring, either the written page or the screen, and that's, in terms of all those perspectives that are sort of, in my head. That's where it comes from. And I should also say that for every influence that is obvious to you, there are 10 that aren't. So, sure, you look at my long lines or the democratic impulse and think Whitman, of course. But what you wouldn't see is the influence of, say, the Puerto Rican poets in my life, because you've never heard of them. And I'm thinking now of a poet by the name of Jack Agüeros, Agueros, those two dots above the U. And Jack Agüeros was indeed a Puerto Rican poet, a fiction writer, a playwright, a community organizer. He was the director of El Museo del Barrio in New York City. Perhaps you've heard of it. And Jack was a friend of my father's and a mentor to me. And so in my last book, Floaters, I have a poem dedicated to Jack. So, you know, he's in there too. You know, it was Jack was writing sonnets in the street. He was gleefully busting up the sonnet form, but he was writing about individuals, the nameless ones, the faceless ones, the people in his community. And this was giving me license to do the same thing, you know. And that influence is at least as pervasive as the influence on Whitman, but you'd never know it.
I think, Sebastian, you had part of your question was also about the kind of personal point of view in poetry rather than the, you know, and versus the general, more general we. Do you want to follow up with that question?
Yeah, I am curious. Yeah, it's really great to hear about all, you know, to kind of expand the perspective. I love the idea that for every one influence that's obvious to me, there are 10 that aren't. But yeah, I'm also interested in that, just that idea of taking a really broad, capacious perspective that I think it strikes me as like relatively uncommon in contemporary poetry and contemporary art more generally. I see there's kind of like an inward turn or a turn to like only speaking from one's own experience, and your work stands out to me in contrast to that. So I wonder like if that's a like if you wish more artists would take that up, or like what are the specific challenges and opportunities that you find in taking on so many perspectives?
Well, the short answer is yes. I wish more artists would take that up, more writers would take that up. We are, of course, reacting to the cultural phenomenon of appropriation. And the fact that once upon a time, it was rather commonplace for people to write or speak from any perspective they wanted. And then that I became essentially untrustworthy. And then there was a response to that. Now, what the I in poetry will often heard referred to as the speaker, and we're always cautioned, oh, don't assume that that's the poet. You know, the I might be somebody else or something else. It might be invented. It might be imagined. It's the speaker. Well, in my poems, the I is me, right? Having said all that, I do believe in finding common ground with other people. Sometimes people you would expect to see in my circle, and sometimes people you would not expect to see in my circle. You'd be surprised, nay, shocked at what poetry can do to cross from one circle to the next, to the next, to the next, and to lower resistance in that way. So I think we need to we need to consider, whether we're poets or whatever our work happens to be, that we absolutely positively have to find common ground with as many people as possible, because we live in dangerous times. The times are always dangerous. These times are dangerous in their own way. And that common ground, finding people with whom we can unite, is essential, because there is so much under threat, and so many people under threat, that we have to join hands.
Thank you. Well, there are a couple of questions from the audience, and one of those questions points us in the direction of Gaza. And so the audience member is asking, given the situation in Gaza, I wonder if Martine might talk about the power of poetry in relationship to Palestine, such as the work of Mahmoud Darwish, or whatever you might want to say about this.
Well, I think, I don't know if people are familiar with that name, but Mahmoud Darwish was a great Palestinian poet. He was translated by various poets in this country, one of whom was Carolyn Forche. I strongly recommend the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish. I strongly recommend finding poets from Palestine in general. And let me sort of zero in on why that's important. Dehumanization is a prerequisite to slaughter. No matter who is killing or being killed, dehumanization comes first. Dehumanization is a prerequisite to slaughter. In order to fully recognize the humanity of people, you should know their literature. You should know their poetry. You should know their writers, right? And of course, we every now and then, we've seen reference to poets in Palestine who have been killed, or writers who have been killed. But let's read them. Let's read the literature. Mahmoud Darwish has been gone for years now. Let's reach back in time. Let's reach back into history and find Darwish and read Darwish. And I think if you do, some of this bloody world will start to make sense. It's so important for us to humanize the dehumanized, because dehumanization is a prerequisite to slaughter.
A powerful argument for poetry in general. The one last question. Let's go with this. The audience member is asking just kind of what gives you hope today?
Well, that's sometimes a tough question to ask.
Yeah.
And a tougher question to answer. What gives me hope is that there was a time when a course like this one didn't exist. Programs like this didn't exist. Schools like this didn't exist. There were times when people like me, poets like me, would never be read in school, in college or high school, whatever it might be. Our world, as it appears to be spinning off its axis, is actually simultaneously getting worse and better. So we can focus on that. We can take away from a conversation like the conversation we've had tonight that the generation that is now arising will take the torch from us and do a far better job with the world than we could ever hope to do. And so I believe what gives me hope on a night like this, and you might get a different answer tomorrow. What gives me hope on a night like this, what gives me hope at a moment like this, is that this generation is here. They're present. They're listening to me. They're listening to you. They're going to do something with it. And what they do with it will make the world a better place than it is now. Of that, I am convinced.
Well, thank you so much, Martine, and for the huge important trail that you've blazed in U.S. poetry that now enables many younger poets, socially, politically engaged, and people of color, LGBTQ plus, to come along and take up the task which they seem to be doing, and it's exciting that they're doing it.
Well, thank you, and thank you for teaching this course. That the realization that the life of the working class is also the stuff of poetry, that the working class has poets within it. These are valuable and necessary observations. So I congratulate you, and I congratulate your students too.
Yes. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you to Michael Lalonde and Sarah Watson and the whole team for making this possible. I want to wish everyone a wonderful night.